Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College. Good morning, pod people. This is Dr. David C. Downing, the co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center in Wheaton, Illinois. And I'm here this morning with my guest interviewer, Laura Schmidt.
Hello, I'm Laura Schmidt, Archivist of the Marion E. Wade Center. And
our in-house resident expert on Tolkien. This morning, we are welcoming Dr. Holly Ordway to discuss her some of her past works, but especially her current research. She's the recipient of the Clydas Kilby Grant for researching a book on Tolkien. She has her PhD from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and has written Not God's Type, an atheist academic lays down her arms, and Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, as well as being part of many book collections. And she is now working on a book called Tolkien's Modern Sources, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. Dr. Ordway, welcome to our discussion this morning.
Oh, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I mean, to be at the Wade Center talking about Tolkien, I mean, you really, in a way, you kind of can't get that any better than that. So it is a real treat to be here and to talk with you folks about my favorite research topic. And we're so glad to have you here. Excellent.
Very much so. Holly, that's kind of an elfin name. Do you think you may have elvish blood somewhere in your background?
Well, possibly, but I'm sort of more Hobbit-like. I think, I would share a little bit with Tolkien the fact of, being a lot like a hobbit. Now, he said in everything except size, but I'm not very tall, so I might even qualify that partially in size, but also very hobbit-like in my enjoyment of good food, good company, nice tea, second breakfast, all of those wonderful things. Excellent.
And I heard that you spoke to the Tolkien Society this week and shared some of your insights from your current book.
I did, and it was a real pleasure. I've been working on this book, Tolkien's Modern Sources, for, at this point, researching it and thinking about it for 6 or 7 years, actively writing it for about 3 years, and I've had, over the course of about the past 2.5 years, had the opportunity now to speak on my researches to various groups. I've spoken twice at the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society to share first some bits about my research on William Morris and his influence on Tolkien, and then to share just a year ago, some bits about my work on children's literature and its influence on Tolkien. And I will be going back and speaking with them a third time this winter on that. And now to have a chance to speak with an American audience to share some of my researches. And it's really exciting to see, to be able to share some of what I've gleaned about Tolkien and his perspective and his creative imagination, which I think adds a dimension to our understanding of Tolkien, and to see people kind of sit up and say, that enlarges my view of Tolkien is really gratifying.
Yeah, and Holly, one reason I'm really excited about your book is this is a pretty big gap in Tolkien scholarship. Can you explain more about the understanding of what Tolkien's influences were in the past and how your book changes that perspective?
Absolutely. Now, the reason that I got interested in Tolkien's modern sources, and the key word there is modern, is in reading The Lord of the Rings. And I've been reading and thinking about The Lord of the Rings for decades. Easily 30 years I've been thinking about his work. My doctoral dissertation, which was many moons ago, centered on Tolkien, and subsequently I just kept thinking about where did The Lord of the Rings come from? And what is its context? And as I thought about that, and as I traced its origins in the context of fantasy literature of the time, I began to feel like there was more going on here than was really accounted for in the critical literature about Tolkien. Because most of the critical literature about Tolkien's sources, his source material, really falls into, 3 categories. The first is the assertion that he had no sources, that he was a purely independent creative genius. And I think we really do have to thank Diana Glyer and her book, The Company They Keep, on really kind of shattering the idea of the lonely genius. And,
right.
And of course, Diana did a lot of research at the Wade.
She did, yes.
Which is huge, being able to really reveal the way that Tolkien and Lewis and Williams and all of them were really interacting. And her work helped me to realize that my question about Tolkien sources was a live one. that there were sources, contra Humphrey Carpenter in a sense, and his idea like, oh, well, he never read anything. Well, he did. So that's one critical take. But when we do get to looking at what critics say about his sources, most critical attention has been on his medieval sources. And I want to say very clearly that his medieval sources are extremely important, and there has been fantastically good work done on it. Mm-hmm. For instance, Tom Shippey is amazing. Lots of really great work. I could just go on about all the great work done on Tolkien as a medievalist. So in looking at his modern sources, I am in no way whatsoever saying that medieval sources weren't extremely important. But they've been viewed as almost the only source. Now,
and there's always been a hard juxtaposition with Tolkien being a modern author, but having these medieval influences. So what do you do with that?
Exactly. And people are kind of seeing it as a paradox. And that interested me. Again, that interested me. And then we've got a sort of third strand in the critical work in his sources where we look at his experiences from his life. And John Garth has done a fantastic job, particularly with Tolkien and the Great War. What a great book.
It's a great book.
And it really opened up, I think, Tolkien scholarship to say, he was a man in the modern world who lived through, the two world wars and had his experience on the front lines in his formative years. And that also helps to kind of connect him to the modern world. But again, this question of can he be purely rooted in the past in medieval literature, yet somehow he lived through the Great War, and yet what is he writing? Is he writing only from medieval sources? So this...
And he speaks to our modern condition
in
a lot of ways. And people have been wondering, how does this get accomplished when his sources are medieval and so much of the structure of the books is a medieval context as well?
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of that can be accounted for by archetypes and the mythic imagery, but I felt that wasn't a complete explanation. So I set myself the task of finding out what did he read in modern literature. And I if you look at Humphrey Carpenter's biography, Carpenter says very, very blithely, oh, Tolkien didn't read anything, modern and didn't take note of the things that he did read. And that really put people on a false trail. And what I've discovered as I've been doing my research is that statement is simply wrong. It's simply incorrect. He, as I've been looking at his writings, at the drafts of On Fairy Stories, at his really combing through his letters and paying attention to them, looking at interviews with his friends, looking at interviews that Tolkien himself did, both in print and in audio. There's a fair number of interviews that really haven't been publicized. They're just in an archive, forgotten, never reprinted. And I discovered that, in fact, Tolkien read quite a lot of modern literature. He cared about it. He had opinions about it. And he even directly acknowledges some very clear sources from modern literature and even points out their effect on his work. But no one has paid attention to these because they've all been either assuming he didn't have sources, assuming he didn't care about modern literature, or really focusing on the medieval literature.
And or not had the gumption to track down all of those interviews and sources, which takes a lot of work.
It does. And then what I've set out to do is whenever I found one of his modern sources, I have read the book. And that's something that I think almost no one has tried to do. Because, for instance, you'll have people, in the Tolkien Encyclopedia mentioning that Tolkien read William Morris, which is pretty well known. But have they in fact read the books of Morris that Tolkien read? I would say no, and frankly for good reason, because they're long. For the modern reader, they're quite dull. But the Roots of the Mountain is like over 400 pages long in pseudo-archaic prose. It's pretty ghastly.
But that very phrase, Roots of the Mountain, shows up in Lord of the Rings.
It does.
Also, the Sundering Seas in William Morris. You find these phrases in Morris. I agree that it's not very good reading on its own. Somewhere in Morris, he's talking about a star, and he says, it's high and lonely majesty. And I hear Lewis's high and lonely destiny from The Magician's Nephew. So I agree with you. It's fun to do source criticism. There's a couple of disadvantages. One is Tolkien and Lewis didn't like source criticism. So they weren't very, especially Tolkien wasn't always that forthcoming about his sources. When they asked him if the ring was related to Wagner's ring, he says, well, they're both round. But he didn't like to talk about sources. And then, in a way, I understand Carpenter's mistake, because the Inklings themselves, as Diana Glyer shows, they denied that they had much influence on each other. So you have to go back. It really is a false trail. You have to go back and retrace the steps to find the kinds of things you're discovering.
And this has been interesting because it has allowed me to get a much better sense of Tolkien's personality. And I've discovered as I've been doing this research, and especially in reading interviews with people who knew him, like Kilby's interviews talking about his recollections of Tolkien, very valuable. And Kilby, for instance, coins a word to describe Tolkien. He says he is contrasistent. That is, he is consistently inconsistent,
right,
in that he delights in confounding our expectations. And that's something that was a real insight, because as I look at the big picture of Tolkien's letters and his interviews, I see consistently a pattern. One is that Tolkien doesn't like being pigeonholed. And if he thinks that you are trying to put him in a box, he will come busting out of that box, guns blazing, so to speak. And then, after he has demolished these confining expectations, then he will come back and say, well, okay, actually, and then he will give nuance, and he will say what points were correct in the original statement, but he just won't stand for being boxed in. And I think we see that with his rejection of influence, because if you look at what a lot of these early commenters on the Inklings were doing, they were using a very restrictive meaning of influence, almost meaning direct copying. And that's not what Tolkien does. It's not what any of them do. And he really wouldn't stand for that. So, for instance, with E.R. Edison, I mean, E.R. Edison wrote the Worm Ouroboros, the Zimianvian trilogy. And Tolkien said that he read everything that Edison wrote and considered him an absolute master. But Edison's philosophy was just completely contrary to Tolkien's, and Tolkien was very clear on that, which I think is interesting. It really shows the flexibility and strength of Tolkien's mind, that he could be completely at odds philosophically and morally with an author, but able to recognize his literary power and enjoy it. But he absolutely denies any influence from Edison, because he doesn't want to be seen to be just copying him. But if we look at how he responds to Edison, we see, for instance, there are different kinds of influence. And I think one of the ways that Edison influences Tolkien is influenced by opposition. He sees the way that Edison, for instance, does his names, which Tolkien thinks is just a complete disaster. And I think as a sort of thing that challenges Tolkien, can I do better? So one of the things I'm doing in this study is I'm teasing out the fact that there are different kinds of influences. There's influence by opposition, where he says, I don't like that. I want to do it better. I want to do it differently. There's influence sort of by an idea, such as Morris's archaism. And I talk about the way that Tolkien really works and draws from Morris's archaic language. And you see the progression where he's very strongly influenced in some of his early works, like The Fall of Gondolin. And I've even been able to track down the pattern of some word usages that he uses that are just directly from Morris. But then he nuances it and he becomes much more sophisticated as he goes on. And we should all give thanks for that. And then there are influences where he pulls out a particular image. And these are the ones that he often notes. Because, for instance, he names the Snurgs in E.A. Wicksmith's The Marvelous Land of Snurgs. And he says that the Snurgs were an unconscious source book for the hobbits. That's a direct quote, an unconscious source book for the hobbits. And if you look at the Snurgs, they're extremely Hobbit-like. And here's Tolkien just naming that. And that, again, is him picking up bits that he found interesting, fruitful, compelling, and they all go into his creative imagination. And he's pulling them together and he's pulling them apart, and they're becoming integrated. And that's where the magic is really happening, in his creative imagination.
Sometimes he doth protest too much. Tom Shippey notes that he said, I don't want you to associate hobbits with rabbits. That doesn't come from rabbits. But then Shippey notes that 5 or 6 times in The Hobbit, someone compares them to rabbits. So I don't know if it's unconscious or if it's that, what was the word you used? Contrasistent?
Yes, contrasistency. He does protest too much. And in fact, I have often found it helpful to kind of poke a little bit more at any place where he does protest so vehemently. It's interesting in the case of the Hobbit rabbit bit that in another letter, he talks about the French translation of Hobbit, because he doesn't like his proper names being translated, but he accepts that they did it in this case. And he says he actually points out that the French translation of the name has a resonance to the French word for rabbit, lapin. I'm rubbish at French. And he likes that. So, and as you noted, David, there are all these references to hobbits being confused with rabbits. So I think, again, he's trying to make things nuanced. He didn't say hobbits are rabbits dressed up in little coats, but they're very rabbit-like. And in fact, one of the things that I have traced is he loved Beatrix Potter, and Beatrix Potter's rabbits are quite interesting if you think about them in terms of hobbits, such as the fact that Peter Rabbit wears has this coat with little brass buttons, and Benjamin Bunny has a waistcoat, and they're very Hobbit-like in some respects.
And they raid the farmer's garden the way that the hobbits do in Lord of the Rings. Didn't he get in trouble for...
Frodo was a mushroom stealer from an early age.
A mushroom stealer.
And Tolkien was as well, actually. That is a autobiographical fact.
Oh, is that correct?
Yeah.
Now, I don't believe that rabbits smoke tobacco, so that would be a different, or pipe weed, I mean.
But they did. They had rabbit tobacco, which is lavender. And so if you look at one of the illustrations in Benjamin Bunny, they have the rabbit hole in a nice little sandy, clean hole with bunches of rabbit tobacco. So they do smoke. They smoke pipes.
I was wrong. We'll edit that out later. What has been your most surprising discovery? Have you said, I never thought Tolkien would have drawn on this author?
I think the most surprising thing has been seeing how much he enjoyed much more realistic novels than I would have expected. So, for instance, he notes in his letters that he stayed up all night reading a book called The Picnic at Saqqara. And, okay, well, what's that book about? Well, it turns out that it's a book about the sort of shenanigans of an English lecturer in Egypt who gets caught up in student political protests. And of all the books that you would think that Tolkien would not only read, but enjoy so much that he couldn't put it down and he stayed up late reading it, a satirical look at Turkish student political activity wouldn't be up there on my list, if you know what I mean.
That's true.
So that discoveries like that, and this, that book is mentioned in the letters, but I tracked down a copy and I read it. And that's how I discovered this insight that Tolkien really did enjoy things outside of what you would expect him to enjoy.
You shared a tidbit with the Tolkien Society the other night that I really enjoyed hearing about Tolkien's knowledge of world events. Can you tell the podcast listeners more about that?
Yes. Now, a lot of people just simply assume that Tolkien must have not cared about anything modern. They think often of C.S. Lewis and how C.S. Lewis famously disclaimed that he never read newspapers and he relied on his friends to tell him if there was anything important in the news. And people often conflate Tolkien and Lewis in that respect. But there's an interview that Tolkien gave in the 1960s where the interviewer, who I think was making this assumption, sort of made some blithe statement about, you probably don't care about the news. And Tolkien said, oh no, I take 3 newspapers. He says he reads 3 newspapers, and he goes on to say quite firmly that he's very interested in what's going on in his town, in his country, and in the world. And he makes those 3 stages, local, national, and world. And he's very emphatic about that. And I thought that's quite striking. And it occurred to me that in Lewis's remark that he had to rely on his friends to tell him if there was anything in the news, he was probably thinking of Tolkien, that Tolkien was one of the friends who was up to date with the news and would let him know if there was anything important. And that shakes our stereotype of Tolkien, I think, as being stuck in the past. He wasn't.
And gives more reasoning for how he might know the pulse of the society and what it needed to hear through the element of story, right?
Exactly, because he
Crafting that.
is so deeply rooted in medieval literature, but he has another foot in the modern world. And one of the things I found it here at the Wade, an interview article with one of Tolkien's students many years later. I think it was Burchfield, but I might be mistaken on the name. And he was recalling Tolkien's gift of being a bridge between the world, say, of Beowulf and the world of the students, that he could help them to experience, the medieval world, have it come to life. And he talked about him as a bridge. And as I was thinking about it, I thought, to be a bridge, you've got to have a foot solidly in both worlds. If Tolkien were only invested in the medieval world, he would understand it completely. He would understand it from the inside, as he does. But were he only to live in that world, he would not have been able to share that with his students the way he so obviously did with such great effectiveness. It's because he understood and cared about the modern world that he was able to take people into the medieval world. And I think that's what's going on with a lot of his, say, The Lord of the Rings. He's drawing so much on all the medieval mindsets. He's trying to provide a corrective, I think, for many of the ills of the modern world. But he's not doing so naively. He's doing so with a recognition of the way that modern people think and what the issues are. And he's using very sophisticated literary techniques to do it. I mean, Verlyn Flieger, she talks about the way that Tolkien uses postmodern meta-narratives. It's amazing because he does. He's using very sophisticated literary techniques, which we could call postmodern, in the service of bridging the medieval and the modern.
And yet he's emphatic. He wants the story to stand on its own and be received for just its wholeness, without trying to parse it apart and find the influences and the tit for tat, allegorical sort of resonances.
And that's something that I've had to grapple with as a source critic of his work. Am I going against what he would want? And, I've thought about that. And I think the key for me is a statement that Tolkien made about reductive analysis. I mean, he gives two different examples. One is he talks about source criticism as analyzing someone's inside of their stomach and trying to figure out by chemical analysis what he had for his dinner. And the other is he talks about the futility of cutting open a ball to find the bounce. And I think the key here is Tolkien quite rightly resists source criticism that destroys the thing that it analyzes, that pulls it apart, like vivisects it, and just leaves it as a dead thing. But Tolkien himself explores things like, where did things come from? I mean, his story Selexpel, he's exploring how did the story of Beowulf come to be.
Right.
He does this himself. And I think we need to enter into the spirit of that and say we're investigating the way that he drew on sources, but investigating it as a living thing. My hope, and this has been the case for me in my own reading of it, my hope is that by looking at how he uses sources, we can see his great work, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion Tales, more living, more alive, more vibrant. Because I think source criticism that kills is bad source criticism, but done right, it gives life, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Right. We murder to dissect, says Wordsworth. I think one problem with source criticism is people don't go beyond the source. They'll say he was influenced by Shakespeare, and then you say, so what? And, excuse me, it's much more interesting to look at the creative adaptation. Lewis wrote what Chaucer did to Il Filostrato, and it's not just that was the source, but how did he adapt the source? Did you find some of that in Tolkien? Did you say, well, here's William Morris, but here's something interesting that he did? Well, I think you already mentioned Edison. It's actually kind of turning Edison on his head in terms of his values. Lewis did the same thing with David Lindsay. He loved the Voyage Dark Tourist, but he didn't like the underlying philosophy. So he pretty much turned that upside down in his own fantasy stories.
Absolutely. And that really is what I'm trying to do in the whole book, because I want to answer the so what question. Okay, great. We can point out these connections, but why should we care? And I think the reason that we care is that when we look at what did Tolkien do with this source, with this influence, and it helps us to better understand his creative imagination, his style. I mean, just recently, the chapter that I've been revising, the last couple of weeks has been the Morris chapter, and looking really closely at the way that he uses archaic language and phrasing, and seeing. I mean, he acknowledges in a letter to his future wife Edith Bratt that he's deliberately trying to model a story after William Morris's romances. So we know that as early as 1918, he's trying to do what Morris is doing. He's deliberately modeling himself on that. And the story that he wrote right about that time was The Fall of Gondolin, the first version of it. And looking at The Fall of Gondolin, it is as chock full of Morrisian archaisms as a fruitcake is full of fruit and nuts. You can really tell. And he uses, for instance, the word amidmost, which is a very Morrisian word. And I've did a Google Ngram search, and it's almost only used by Morris. It's used by almost no one else.
Well, we use that around the Wade quite frequently. Amidmost? I'm sorry. Maybe we don't.
Well, it would be fitting if you did, especially if you're hearkening back to olden days and things like that as you're doing it.
The two I noticed from Morris, you don't notice them in Tolkien until you see them in Morris. One of them is fell, meaning cruel. We say a fell swoop, but Tolkien loves, he was a fell warrior and it was a fell stroke. And the other one is they were full of wrath. In Lord of the Rings, people are not angry or vexed or irritated or resentful. They are full of wrath. And when you go to William Morris, you see that phrase. And sometimes I see it in Tolkien. When I go to a source, you suddenly recognize that that's where Tolkien got that kind of language.
Exactly. But the interesting thing is that you don't notice it. It doesn't stand out in Tolkien because he has so thoroughly integrated it. Morris, it's sort of like driving over cobbles. You're noticing it every bone jarring, and seeing the way, like for instance with the midmost, he's used, and some certain like syntactical inversions and things like that. He's really going whole hog in The Fall of Gondolin, this early tale, and it's so obvious. And then he moderates it, and he becomes much more sophisticated in his use of shifting registers. Now, something that people sometimes criticize The Lord of the Rings, they say that the tone is uneven, but he's using different registers for different reasons. The hobbits are speaking differently than the Lords of Gondolin, and differently from the elves, and he's using it at different times. They speak in a more lofty way at certain points and then less so in others. And what we get in Morris is just all even. It's all the high register all the time. But when we get to Tolkien, you look at something, and this is a passage that I analyze in this chapter, the Council of Elrond, and you have the tone, the register rises, it becomes very lofty, and then Bilbo steps in and says, okay, guys, now what? And it brings it back down again in a way that prevents it from ever kind of launching into the space of over loftiness. And then it allows Tolkien to then gradually raise the register again, but to a middle tone, so that when you get Frodo saying, "I will take the ring," it's serious, it's calm, it's deeply moving, and he's orchestrated the registers in this passage so skillfully that you've got the high, the low, and then the middle, and it's a act of virtuosity in terms of literary tone. And that's the kind of thing that I see as him using what he's doing. He's clearly acknowledged the influence of Morris's syntax and archaic language, but he's worked with it, he's thought about it, he's adapted it, and now he's using it far more skillfully than Morris ever did to achieve his own literary ends. And I think if we see what he did, it allows us, certainly has allowed me, to better appreciate, wow, this is an amazingly skillfully crafted scene.
And he has such a great command of language. And there's plenty of times where the word he chooses is the exact right word. And you have to even look it up in the dictionary because it's not used so frequently anymore.
But it's the right word.
It's the right word, yeah.
But sometimes even it's not an obscure word. After they shoot down the creature that's coming when they're on the river, and they shoot down the creature that was going to join the orcs, and he looks up and he says, the sky was clean again. What a perfect word choice for their feeling of having that creature destroyed. Another one I think of, and he often uses what we think of as poetic techniques. There's a lot of alliteration. I wonder if sometimes all that alliterative Anglo-Saxon poetry gets into his prose.
Oh, I'm sure it does.
Oh, yeah.
Another time he was describing the creature that the ring wraith arrived on, and he says, he must have been bred in some eyrie with all these fell meats, and his fingers, he had no feathers. And remember that long description? At the very end, he says, and it stank. Just very short, but that's a very poetic sort of technique in his prose. I want to mention another thing. You mentioned his modernity. Many of his sources that he would have studied, they don't have much psychology. When you read Beowulf or Gawain and the Green Knight, it doesn't go into the characters' heads very often. But I'm fascinated how often Tolkien will say Sam thought he saw eyes looking out the windows, or he didn't like the fact that there were no trees.
It seemed to him is another term he'll use from time to time, yes.
And that's a very modern narrative technique to really blend the psychology of the characters in with the narrative.
Yes, and that's a great insight, because a lot of people miss that. You have people who, it just drives me crazy. They'll say, oh, the characters in Lord of the Rings are all just cardboard figures. Have you read the book?
Right.
Really? Because they're not. We have a certain expectation brought to the text from outside the text that, oh, if it's an epic, the characters are not going to be nuanced. But Tolkien confounds that expectation. He gives us a great deal of interior musings, perspectives of different characters, conflict. I mean, I was struck, I'm rereading The Lord of the Rings right now, and I've been really struck by the way that Aragorn is not a cardboard cutout hero leader. He's constantly in doubt all the way through the Fellowship of the Ring and the beginning of the Two Towers, the first half of the Two Towers. He's constantly doubting, am I doing the right thing? What choice will I need to make once we get to the place where the Fellowship ends? He doesn't know. He has the debate with Gandalf about, do they go over the mountains or do they go through Moria? Right. And you get a real sense that he genuinely doesn't know, and he's grappling with, well, given limited information and a very important quest, what is the right decision? He doesn't know, and he has to act in uncertainty. And I think that's an extremely modern approach. You don't see that kind of thing in the saga literature.
And I will add that he doesn't doubt his heritage. He doesn't doubt his calling to become king. He's very strong in those points, actually, which is a less modern approach. But you're right. He does have all these elements of, what should I do as a leader in this situation? And Gandalf is gone. I've got to call the shots now. This is a difficult decision to make. I want to make sure that the quest is not going to fail because of my poor wisdom or understanding of the context.
And he has to make the decision with inadequate information.
Yes.
And that's such a modern dilemma. And this is such a great point, Laura, because again, he's bridging. Mm-hmm. Because for the modern reader, and I think we see this, in even the film adaptations, that we tend now as moderns to make if we're going to have a hero, he has to question everything. Mm-hmm. He can't be confident about anything. He has to be angsty and self-doubting to the core. And as you say, Aragorn's not like that, because he knows his heritage. Right. He knows what he's called to do. But he's very modern in the way that he is uncertain about how to best go about it. And did he make the right decision? Right. And so Tolkien puts us inside his head in a way that the medieval writers never would have. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's something that's a very sophisticated blending of the medieval and the modern. Now, Tolkien is a genius writer. Could he have invented this approach himself? Possibly. But we don't have to think that, because we know that he read modern literature that was psychological. I mean, he notes that he read all of Sinclair Lewis's books, modern American realist novelist. He was one of the people who nominated Forster for the Nobel Prize. I mean, he wouldn't have done that if he hadn't had at least a decent regard for Forster's books, whatever other motivations there might have been for putting that name forward. So he read modern psychological literature. He knew what the possibilities were, and he could draw on that.
And didn't he say that Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt was a possible source for the word Hobbit?
Yes.
That surprised me because I don't associate the character Babbitt. There's nothing Hobbitish at all about that character.
Probably just the sound of the word, like
Yeah,
the
just maybe
language
the sound of the
influence.
word.
Well, there
Right.
actually is a bit of Hobbitishness about that,
Oh, is that
because
right?
he's very sort of middle class and comfortable and bourgeois, and you can almost see him as how Bilbo Baggins might have been if he hadn't had the Tookish strain.
Yeah, okay. When he always has his shoes on, so we don't see if he has hairy feet or not. So we'll never know about that part. Your research is here at the Wade. Have you had any specific item that's been either confirmed or disconfirmed?
Well, I did have a couple of things I've found that have been interesting. I came into my researches more thinking, what will I find? I mean, that's the goal of the researcher. You need
That's
to
a great approach, by the way.
Right, I agree.
Rather than I'm coming to prove my theory, you let the materials lead the way, and that's the right approach.
Right, I totally agree.
Yeah, because you don't know what you're going to find,
Right.
and you have to look places fully aware that you might not find anything of interest. But you don't know, so you just look and you see and you find what you find, and then you have to, like you said, Laura, you have to account for the evidence, not.
Absolutely.
But one of the things that I found, and I will just tease your listeners with this, I found in the Wade the pointer to identify the source for the Crack of Doom name, which I'm not going to say anything more because this is just a teaser for your listeners, but I was able to make some connections after my last Wade visit to identify the source. So I won't say anything more about that. But another thing that I found in my Wade Center researches is I was looking at the back issues of the Parma El Delameron, which is the linguistics journal, and it's got various transcriptions and transliterations and translations of Tolkien's Elvish writing, and he did lots of scraps of doodling in Elvish, and one of the collections of his doodles turns out to be a whole bunch of versions in Elvish script of Lewis Carroll's poem, The Walrus and the Carpenter. And there's something like 3 or 4 different versions of this in Elvish that he's done. And the interesting thing is that the way that he's done it, it's clear that he's done it from memory because it's not word for word precise. And we know from other comments people have made that he enjoyed memorizing and reciting songs and poems from the books that he read. So, for instance, he would go around quoting and singing bits from Lewis Carroll's Sylvie and Bruno books, and he would go around singing some of the songs from G.K. Chesterton's The Flying Inn. So we have here him, writing down bits from Carroll's The Walrus and the Carpenter. And this just shows the way that he obviously had a high regard for Lewis Carroll, knew his work well, and this is a modern author. And it just shows how much he was engaging with it, not just as a nod, like, oh yeah, I read that one time, but he knew and enjoyed this poem enough to be using it as one of his practice texts for Elvish.
Right.
Yeah, that does sound like a revelation. I was doing a radio interview once on Narnia, and the interviewer said, "Oh, I just love Alice in Wonderland." I was talking about C.S. Lewis.
Oh, dear.
And so I had to say, so did Lewis. And Tolkien. I had to take it in a different direction there. Well, we certainly look forward to the publication of the book. When does it due
Absolutely.
out?
Well, that will be in my editor's hands at Kent State University Press, but I'm right now finishing up. This is fall of 2018. I'm just about finished, and soon, now counting in months, not years, in a few months, we'll have the manuscript in my editor's hands, and then I'm hoping we'll see it sometime in 2019.
Okay.
Wonderful.
And give us that title one more time.
It will be Tolkien's Modern Sources, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages.
Clever title.
We'll look forward to that. Yes.
Yes, we do. Thanks so much for joining us today. And we will look forward to the book and maybe another interview so that our listeners can find out the secret that you will not reveal today.
Excellent. Well, it's been a real pleasure to be on, and I'm just so grateful to be able to come to the Wade Center. I'm grateful for the Wade Center's support in the form of the Kilby grants, and I'm just thrilled to be on this broadcast.
Great.
Thank you so much, Holly.
Yes, thank you.